the dismissal bell rang, streams of happy children poured out of the school building. It was a beautiful sunny day. Everyone wanted to get home in a hurry to play. Webster was one of the last students to leave school. He had stayed after class for some extra help in math. When he walked out of the classroom and into the hall, all of his friends were gone, except Todd Collins. Todd was leaning against the wall with his hands in his pockets and his eyes staring down at the floor. Webster called to his friend.
Hi, Todd. Why are you still here?
Todd raised his head and looked around.
I was waiting for you, Webster.
Todd stammered.
I thought maybe I could go over to your house and play for a while.
Webster slipped on his backpack and smiled at his friend.
That would be great, but don't you have to go home first? Won't your mom be worried about you? My mom got a new job. She works lots of hours, but the pay is real good, and we sure need it. Well, do you stay alone till your mom gets home? Mom hired a sitter, Mrs. Smith. I'm supposed to go to her house and play and have a snack and do my homework there. But I'd rather go to your house. Webster, please, can I?
Webster smiled and grabbed his friend's arm.
George and Catherine won't mind. Let's go.
Todd heaved a big sigh of relief. He and Webster left the school building and walked off happily down the street. When the two boys reached Webster's house, they found George in the kitchen.
Hi, George. I'm home,
called Webster. George knelt down and gave Webster a big hug.
Well, Webster, did you get your math problem all straightened out?
I sure did.
Webster replied.
Now I understand equations pretty well. Not as good as Einstein, but pretty well.
Then Webster added,
Todd came over to play. Is it okay, George?
George stood up and stretched his hand out to Todd.
Sure, it's okay. Hi, Todd. Do you want to phone your mom and tell her you're here?
Todd shook his head.
My mom is at work. I stay with a sitter now, and I phoned her before I left school.
Webster was a little puzzled. He didn't remember Todd's making a phone call. Was Todd lying? Just then, George offered the boys some cookies and milk, and Webster forgot all about Todd's puzzling answer.
Cookies sound great, George. I'm starved. How about you, Todd? I'm not very hungry, but then I never am. I don't feel much like eating lately. I'll just wait till you're finished, and then we can play a game.
A little while later, when Catherine came in, she found Webster, Todd, and George at the kitchen table playing a card game.
Hi, guys. What's going on?
George stood up to greet his wife with a quick kiss on the cheek. Then he explained,
Hi, honey. Just a minute. I have an important play to make.
George put a card down on the table. Webster picked it up and chuckled.
That's it. I'm out.
Todd then picked up the card Webster put down and said,
I'm out too.
George groaned.
Rats. I'm the old maid again. That's the 8th game I've lost.
Everyone laughed. Just then, Todd looked up at the clock on the wall and announced,
I've got to be going now. My mom should be home from work any minute. Thanks for letting me come over, Webster. Really, thanks a lot.
Then, scooping up his books, Todd dashed out the door, calling back,
Bye, everyone.
After the door slammed shut, Catherine looked at George and asked,
What's that all about?
George shrugged his shoulders.
Todd has a new sitter. I guess he doesn't like going to her house.
That's odd. When I met his mom at the supermarket last week, she told me how thrilled she was to get Mrs. Smith to watch Todd because Mrs. Smith likes children so much, and she especially likes Todd. It's very strange.
The next day after school, Todd was waiting for Webster again. This time, he hurried down to Webster and grabbed his arm, pleading.
Please, Webster. Please, can I come to your house? Please.
Webster sensed something was wrong.
Sure, Todd, but your sitter. Won't she be worried?
Todd gulped.
called her. Besides, I like your house better. Your dad plays neat games. Doesn't your sitter play games with you?
Todd's face froze in fear. Then slowly the fear turned to anger as he answered.
I don't like the games Mrs. Smith plays. I hate them. I hate her and her tickling games.
Webster was confused.
What's wrong with tickling? I think it's kind of fun.
Todd glanced around the empty hall to make sure no one could hear him. Even though they were alone, he leaned close to Webster and whispered.
If I tell you, do you promise not to tell anyone else?
Webster nodded and Todd explained breathlessly.
Mrs. Smith tickles me in places I don't want to be tickled. She tickles me in what my mom says are private places.
Webster knew what Todd meant by private places, and the thought of being touched or tickled there frightened him.
Did you tell your mom, Todd?
Todd shook his head slowly and sadly.
I can't tell her. She needs this job to support us. She said I have to obey Mrs. Smith, and I know I'd get in trouble if I told. But Webster, I don't want to play Mrs. Smith's games anymore, and the only way not to is not to go there.
Webster nodded.
I see what you mean, Todd. You don't have to go to Mrs. Smith's house if you don't want to. You can come to my house.
Todd's face brightened into a smile as Webster put his arm around his shoulder, and the two boys headed home. Later that afternoon, when Catherine came home, she found George, Webster, and Todd watching cartoons.
Hi, ma'am.
Webster called out as she entered the room, and he leaped off the couch and ran over to give her a hug.
Hi, Webster. George. Hi, Todd.
Catherine nodded toward the TV, and George turned it off. Then Catherine sat down on the sofa and looked squarely at Todd.
I need to talk to you for a minute, Todd.
Todd went over to the sofa and sat down next to Catherine. Catherine smiled warmly at the boy as she explained.
I saw your mom at lunch today, Todd. She told me all about her new job and all about Mrs. Smith, your new sitter.
Todd gasped. His hands started to shake and he slumped down on the couch as if he hoped the cushions would hide him. Catherine went on.
Todd, you know you're welcome here anytime, but your mom is paying the sitter a lot of money to look after you. Mrs. Smith was worried when you didn't show up yesterday, and I'm sure she's worried that you're not there today either.
Webster started to open his mouth to speak, but a warning look from Todd reminded Webster of his promise to keep Todd's secret. Todd apologized to Catherine.
I'm sorry. I won't come here after school anymore.
And before anyone could speak, Todd gathered up his books and left. That evening, as Catherine, George, and Webster washed and dried the dinner dishes, Catherine brought up the subject of Todd again.
I'm worried about that boy. He acted very strangely this afternoon. I think I'll phone his mom and have a little talk with her.
George put down the dish he was drying and turned to his wife.
And what are you going to say? That the kid hates his sitter?
Catherine was puzzled.
No, but I don't know why he dislikes her so much. Mrs. Smith is new in town, but she's supposed to be very good with children. In fact, I was even thinking of asking her to sit with Webster when we go to that charity ball next week.
The dish Webster was putting away fell from his hands and crashed loudly on the floor, breaking into pieces. Catherine and George turned to him only to hear him yell,
No, I won't stay with Mrs. Smith.
George and Catherine looked at each other in shock.
What's wrong, Webster?
George asked as he bent to help Webster pick up the pieces.
Mrs. Smith will play games with you. It will be fun.
Webster jumped down from the chair he was standing on.
No, she's not going to tickle me like that.
Webster screamed as he ran out of the kitchen and straight up into his room. George and Catherine hurried after Webster and sat down beside him on his bed. Webster was sobbing uncontrollably as Catherine put her hand gently on his back.
Webster, this kind of outburst isn't like you. What did you mean when you said you wouldn't let Mrs. Smith tickle you like that? Like what?
Webster turned his head toward Catherine, then toward George, who was standing beside the bed. He took a deep breath and explained.
I promised Todd I wouldn't tell. He doesn't want anyone to know.
Catherine and George exchanged glances. Then Catherine said gently,
Webster, most of the time it's important to keep a promise, but sometimes it's not a good thing. I think this is one of those times when it's not.
Webster looked hesitantly at George. George nodded slowly. Webster felt better. He was convinced that he had to tell his parents all about Todd's secret, because it was making his friends so unhappy, so frightened. So he told them all about the game and Mrs. Smith's bad way of tickling. When Webster finished his story, he lowered his head. He was too embarrassed to look directly at his parents. Catherine smiled her warm, reassuring smile and reached over and gave Webster a hug.
Don't worry, Webster. You did the right thing by telling us.
Webster wasn't that certain as he looked over at George.
If I did the right thing, why does George look so mad?
George's face showed that he was really angry.
I'm not mad at you, Webster. I'm mad at Mrs. Smith. She's doing things that are wrong, but you did the right thing. If you had kept that secret, things would only have gotten worse for Todd. You see, when adults touch children in private parts of their body, or when they make children do things that make them feel uncomfortable and unhappy, that's called child molestation.
Webster, Todd was molested. It's a very sad thing, but it happens to many children. The grown-ups who molest children are really very sick people. What we have to do now is to take the right steps and make things better for Todd.
Then Catherine stood up and said to George,
We have to notify the police, and they'll put us in touch with our local Center for Prevention of Child Abuse. More importantly, we have to talk to Todd's mom before we do anything else.
I think that's the best way to handle this.
Webster agreed too, but he was concerned about one thing.
Ma'am, do you think Todd will be mad at me?
George answered for his wife.
How could he be mad at a good friend like you?
For the first time since he had learned Todd's secret, Webster was able to smile.
You know, I'm a lucky kid to have two parents as smart as you.
It was still early, and since tomorrow was Saturday and no school, Catherine phoned the Collins house and invited Linda Collins to come by for a cup of coffee and to bring Todd along to play with Webster. A short time later, Catherine was with Todd's mother, explaining what she had learned from Webster. Mrs. Collins was astonished.
I wouldn't have believed it. Mrs. Smith seemed so nice. I never suspected. Poor Todd. He was so afraid to tell me about the tickling game.
Mrs. Collins paused to shake her head.
I should have noticed the warning signs. He was having trouble falling asleep, and when he finally did, he often had bad dreams. He's lost his appetite and hardly eats anymore. And he just hasn't been talking to me lately about things that bother him. Todd and I have always been so close, and yet he still felt he couldn't tell me.
Mrs. Collins began to sob quietly. Catherine patted her friend's shaking hand.
Don't blame yourself, Linda. Many of us parents don't recognize those warning signs. We know that child molestation is a serious problem, but we don't think it'll happen to our own kids. Why, it could even have happened to Webster.
Todd's mother nodded.
I guess I do blame myself, though. I was having so many of my own problems. I didn't see that Todd was having a problem of his own.
Catherine smiled gently at Linda Collins.
Being the only parent in a household isn't an easy job. The important thing is we found out in time to help Todd.
As the two women were finishing their coffee, George entered the room.
Webster and Todd are playing old maid. How is everything in here?
Okay, I guess. Linda and I still can't believe how Mrs. Smith had everyone fooled.
Well, she won't be bothering any more children. I notified the authorities this afternoon, and they're dealing with her now.
Mrs. Collins thought of something else.
I wonder if other children are keeping secrets they're afraid or ashamed to tell about.
Catherine and George nodded. Then George said,
There are probably lots of children who've been molested and can't talk about it. What can parents do about it?
I'm going to take Todd to the local division of Youth and Family Services.
said Mrs. Collins.
They have counselors there who know exactly how to talk to children and help them talk about their secrets. They also send speakers to schools to talk about the dangers of child molestation. Perhaps we can arrange for one at Todd and Webster's school.
Catherine perked up.
That sounds like a presentation I'd like to hear.
Me too. You arrange it, Linda, and we'll be there for sure.
Several days later, the children and many parents were on hand for the presentation at Webster's school. The counselor from the Division of Youth and Family Services introduced herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Karen. Today, boys and girls, we are going to talk about something very important. We are going to talk about touching. There are two kinds of touches, good touches and bad touches. Can someone give me an example of a good touch?
Webster raised his hand and answered.
A good touch is a hug from your mom or dad.
Yes, that's right, Webster. Now, who can tell us which kind of touch is a bad touch?
Slowly and shyly, Todd raised his hand and said softly,
Sometimes tickling can be a bad touch.
Right, Todd.
agreed Karen.
Tickling can be bad if someone won't stop when you tell them to stop. It can also be bad if someone tickles you in places where you don't want to be tickled.
Everyone nodded in agreement. Karen went on to talk about other kinds of bad touches.
Remember, boys and girls, a bad touch isn't your fault. People aren't allowed to touch you in ways you don't want them to. Your body belongs to you. Also, there's a power that belongs to you, too.
The children looked puzzled as Karen asked.
Did you know you have power?
Webster raised his hand and asked,
What kind of power?
You have the power to say no. If someone wants to touch you in a way you don't like, say no. Say it loud. No. Then go. Go away from that person. Remember those words. No, go. And go tell someone what happened. Tell someone you trust, like your parents, or a relative, or a teacher, or a good friend.
Todd looked at Webster and smiled. Webster smiled back. Karen repeated,
Remember, say no, then go and tell.
When Karen's presentation was over, George and Catherine waited for Webster to join them.
That sure was a great presentation. All the kids are talking about it.
George took Webster by the hand and asked,
Are you ready to go home?
I want to see Todd first. Oh, there he is. Hi, Todd. Want to come over to my house and play?
Todd shook his head no.
Thanks, Webster, but I have to go to my new sitter's house. That's her over there with my mom. She's nice and I like her very much.
Webster looked at the smiling woman Todd was pointing at and whispered,
Aren't you afraid anymore? Not me. Now I know I have power. Right.
Webster answered as George and Catherine smiled. Together the boys shouted,
No. No. Go and tell. Our bodies belong to us. That's power. That's power.
It's your body.